All right, here we go. Okay, so we had two things on the agenda, just like we did last week. One was continuation, Dennis, of your conversation. We start with that, and the second one was my discussion on the white paper, the architecture white paper. I kind of laid an outline out and threw it out there. So you want to start with yours,
Sure.
Dennis, and here comes Forrest. If you want to start with yours, and then I'll finish up with mine.
Yeah, I'll rip through it fast. I think it's only 5 slides and it's much more focused nowadays. So, can you see that?
Yes, it's in power. It's not in slideshow mode, but we see it.
I'll try to fix that. Let's see. View, reading mode.
Down the right, down the bottom right, there's a little project. Okay, you're good. That's good. That works.
Um, so, let's see, get the controls. There we go. So I'm trying to address some concerns we've had with respect to
Oh, I like it.
placing the usage of the materials that we've been talking about within the working group in a place that we can. This I could do actionably, that is, I could figure this part out. It is just the boilerplate out of a authoritative source for the Creative Commons stuff.
Thank you. Thank you.
But if you have a better one, or if you can figure out what's the right string to get the CC0 in their notation into a footer, then I can do that on the PowerPoint templates as well. But the intention here is that everything that we're talking about is freely usable, refinable, improvable, without any constraint whatsoever.
Thank you.
So per the last meeting, we're parking interactions with external groups until we're ready to form a project or sub-project, which means we really need to get some scoping down and run what we intend to do that. That means beginning to narrow some things, and I think we've got some contextual stuff to do there. The focus of the effort that we've been doing in this group has split into two domains. The first is to pursue the relatively low-hanging fruit and how EDR can be leveraged with that low-hanging fruit in something like OCA PACE and integrated with underlying technologies like OS Query and the extensions that are associated there. There is a level of usage of EDR, however, which is far, far beyond that. And when we used EDR as a use case, that triggered my interest in, okay, what do we have to do with ontology? What do we have to do with integration? What do we have to do with automation in order to be able to bring full-blown EDR capability, the stuff required in the executive order, and the stuff necessary to go after emergent supply chain attacks, that level of functionality into the domain, which I think is significantly beyond what we can do sort of with the current marching orders. So to that end, what I needed to do was get a handle on what's happening with the EDR tools in terms of their functionalities, their interfaces. Where are the fixed points that we can leverage, the commonalities that actually span across tooling, but all cross usages as well. And to do so, to make sure that we accommodate potentially open source EDR capability. So first question for the group in doing that is I need to expand my list of open source EDR specific kinds of capability. The two most common are probably Komodo for endpoint, Google Rapid Response for sort of cloud scale and cloud native-ish technologies, both of which cover all of sort of EDR/NDR capability. Bluespawn, but it's purely academic, not much of a footprint. Would be interesting if you guys have ideas about any other open source capabilities that should be in this list that we should use in normalizing or looking at normalization of how you interact with those particular systems. The second question, if while you're thinking about what are the open source alternatives that should be added, is for the non-open source products. There are two ways to look at integration. They're going after their commercial APIs, which force us into commercial vocabularies and taxonomies of how to interact with those systems. But there are also normalized mappings. That is, every last one of the commercial EDR, NDR, MDR capabilities is doing mappings directly into attack. And the reason that they're doing that is because that is a cross-product comparison effort happening at scale that's being used by an awful lot of folks. So it's competitively untenable to not have a mapping into the attack matrix where I can get both behavior and state/indicator description in a broad sense. Of course, attack is about characterizing behavior and the things that you look for in that behavior, but it has a nice interface that is a nice adjacency, at least semantics wise, to the kinds of indicator sharing mechanisms that are out there as well. Sticks is a classic example of those, where it focuses on not the platform, not the analytics, but what's communicated between teams that are cooperating/collaborating. So 2 open questions that it would be good to get feedback on. What should I add to the list in the open source things that we can look at? Since we're not engaging external parties in conversations until we have a project or sub-project definition that would invoke the right kinds of governance, I'm sort of limiting the normalization to those and what's publicly available about those, even the commercial products to some extent. And then secondly, what kind of anchoring are we going to do? Or are we going to anchor to the commercial vocabularies a la their commercially supported and exposed APIs? Or are we going to anchor to a normalization they already map to, something like the attack matrix? Those are things we need to decide. They don't have to be decided now, but if you have feedback on them, we're certainly interested in.
One question I had is on the normalization stuff. Do you think we can map in stick shifter here where we're normalizing endpoint products?
For the threat modeling side of the fence, which is of course a subset of cybersecurity, but for the threat modeling side of the fence and for the places where the sticks normalization is adequate, that's okay. But if you look at all of the mappings of stick shifter to the various products, you see rather extreme variation in both the capabilities that have been integrated and the comparability of those capabilities. So look at Carbon Black versus integration with any of the others, right? It's very, very different. And so even the normalization that Sticks provides, well, it provides you a vocabulary implementable across all of them, the coverage of the implementation, the semantics of what happens, what you get back, what it means, are very, very different. So I think we could get much better if we controlled more of what happens on either side of Sticks rather than what Sticks is doing, which is sort of allowing you to communicate whatever the tool communicates or collects or brings across. There isn't a normalization of the problem or the attack except with respect to the subset of behaviors each of the toolings exposes. And so I think it's connectable. I'm worried about the utility. Unless we tied Sticks to something where we got more insight. Now, maybe there's an integration there between Sticks and attack that lets us then say, oh yeah, Carbon Black sees it this way, CrowdStrike sees it that way, and now we can connect the dots because we can see how it's all related to a higher level thing in something like attack. But just from the indications, from the ability to say, search for this string and the ability to say, block that pattern, the normalization is pretty limited in what stick shifters implementations have done to date, if that makes sense.
Well, I hear what you're saying. I'm just wondering, is that an evolving question? I mean, over periods of time, if we identify other things that we could add to Sticks to extend it out a little bit more, at least we have a foundation to work from versus we don't have anything, and then we can kind of evolve. That's what I was thinking. And then the other point I'll make to you is on top of the stick shifter is the Kestrel, which is the threat hunting language, mapping to the unique proprietary tip languages that every one of them has. Again, it's not 100%, but I'm just thinking of a model. At least we have something to start with, and then we evolve, and we go back into Sticks maybe, and so morph it out a little bit more. That's what I was thinking.
Think how you would solve this problem. Maybe that's a better way. The reason we're in this mode,
yes, that's right.
This situation, is because each of the tools made a trade-off about their own points of view of how they have what their telemetry does and how that should be used to do what they're doing and how it maps to their curated intelligence feeds.
Absolutely.
They've dropped anchor in a place that is hard to to normalize because they all have their own ecosystems built around that stuff. So a lot of inertia to moving it. Suppose though, Stix was able to communicate more than just what the indicator stuff that has been sort of the focus of all of this. It requires more trust. So in moving indicators across, if I'm going to expand it to be full-blown TTPs, the challenge has always been those include forensic information, and that may not be tolerable in terms of the trust relationship between the sharers using Stix. So suppose though, Stix, in addition to Cybox and Mike and the taxi-ish lightweight stuff, could also do a reference to I'm sharing an attack behavior that's been correlated with my indicators. All of a sudden, context starts coming across that link, and the things get much more, much richer in terms of what I can connect. So I think there are ways to move the ball forward, so that we could get more with them. And I think this inherent comparison effort that's happening at MITRE across the EDR and XDR tools, all of them, is actually forcing them to come to grips with those differences competitively. And that's interesting because I think it's moving the ball forward as well. So as the vendors decide to be more comparable, because now they're comparable in an empirical sense, I think we're going to see an awful lot more normalization by virtue of them moving toward the same target.
Right, and I don't know if you were on the IOB call, but they also recognize Stix and how they're starting to use even Stix Shifter to drive out indication of behavior kind of actions. So I think it's an evolution. So I just think our assumption should be here. We use that as our basis and we evolve from it. It's not everything, but as part of the work group here, we may find things we want to propose to, as you said, get to the more extensive information we need to collect, and then we can propose, extending each of these things to do that.
Yeah,
Where appropriate. Not everything's going to be there, but I think it'd be better to try and do that than not try.
Morning, gentlemen. I'd like to add a comment here. So, what you're describing there is what killed Open IOC. Had great luck in engaging with Mandiant, but we got to the point of trying to extend Open IOC to look beyond their mirror view of the world. They had extension points, but trying to get it into the standard is what led me personally to hook my wagon to the Stix effort.
Right.
And we got similarly constrained, I'll say. So in terms of extending Stix to do more, and Vaz is, I think, taking a fresh run at that. And we're taking sort of a different run at it on the threat actor context ontology to try to do an overlay that subsumes.
Okay.
But I'm just saying, one of the things as far as the strategy, it's one thing to propose it, but you need some people to actually go and do the work of building out the spec and driving it to consensus in the community.
Oh yeah, no, certainly. I'm just trying to put it on the table so I can get the conversation focused versus
No, I'm not being critical. I'm just
no,
saying,
I agree with you. I agree.
wondering to rule them all. I'm sorry.
No, that's right. That's right. But
do all over again. Anybody remember IO Def?
Yeah.
Go ahead, gentlemen.
I still got some scar tissue over conversations with Kathleen Moriarty over that. At any rate, so the questions are still, to some extent, unanswered. I don't think we solve all of what we need to in bridging the XDR tools by just adopting what Stix Shifter did. I still also, to some extent, need to understand the scope of the APIs of those tools to the extent that they're not covered in Stix Shifter. The question is, do we leave that functionality orphaned and make it inaccessible through our normalization? And that probably presents its own set of challenges for the various usages of the detection and response tools.
Yeah,
and emergent threat detection response. Go ahead.
Yeah, and or maybe Stix isn't the venue, something else is, so that's okay too, right?
Well, but Stix already has lots of substandards that are part and parcel of how Stix communicates.
Yes.
So it's probably not a big stretch to expand that vocabulary without having to change Stix 2 fundamentally. Although reasoning within Stix about those attached things is a tougher proposition.
So certainly.
So just status as of today, and in reining things down from the broader questions to these more specific questions, the scope of the size of the list that we're embracing, we focused on the first objective, which is which was identified in the last status document on indication and behavior normalization. What do we have to consider there in terms of extension to be able to embrace that in schema / ontology to get there? The core issue behind indications and behavior is that they're invariant. They're something we communicate regardless of what the tool is. The problem is often, though, there's a lot of context loaded in an EDR tool being used for threat hunting, and you look at an indicator and you know a lot about that indicator by virtue of that use case, the way it's being used. When you expose it to the rest, though, of the security portfolio and you try to do integration and automation, you need more explicitness. And let me give you an example of what that looks like. When we deal with EDR information, the artifacts that EDR tools refer to in all of what they do about behavior and about indicators and about identifiers, that information all comes from somewhere, and it has different tenses associated with it. Some of the information is, what is the component that's vulnerable, that's being exploited right now? And that is information that's defined almost at development or provisioning time associated with the components that are there. It's the things that tell you what's the application or what's the version associated with it. Sometimes we lean on ad hoc indications. Think of what we did with log4j. Lots and lots of the IOCs had the string log4j in it, which was the thing we were hunting for in a relatively ad hoc way. Now that we've got versions that are both vulnerable and immune to the exploitation, looking for strings like log4j is no longer adequate. We actually need some version specificity. If you think about composition and supply chains and other stuff, all of a sudden you're going to begin needing things like software IDs, either things like that standardized, or the things that are being embedded in SBOMs like Cyclone DX, SPDX, and GUIDs around the components that you're referring to. But those are things defined by the folks that are building the artifacts that are either vulnerable or not, that are being deployed, that are being run at runtime. But there's also stuff that we get at runtime that's an artifact of how things are running and how they respond to load balancing and scaling and all of the normal dynamics in an operational enterprise. And there's that set of kinds of operational information that EDR tools rely on very, very heavily to do what they do in terms of their use cases. And then there's the curated intelligence stuff, some that is a consequence of analysis that lets them understand, okay, how do I look for X? How do I represent behavior Y? What's the interactions across the stack or across assets in an actual attack prosecution of whatever kind? And then, of course, the things that you can do about it. How do I recognize it? What do I do in terms of being able to verify that I've applied a mitigation or remediation successfully in the environment, so the verification stuff. But in all of this, there's a sense of tense. I can have, as I do with registry entries in window, exactly the same indicator be something I intended, a registry setting that was decided by the developers, something that I expected, something I observed during test, wasn't decided by the developers, but was a consequence of what I observed during my testing, and so should be expected at runtime. And then separately, the center column, what do I observe at runtime, regardless of what I intended or should expect, because some things may be compromised, or I may have variation I never accounted for. In those circumstances, I've got a discrepancy that I may have to explain in some way. And then the curated stuff turns those exact same attributes into either relevant or not relevant to indicating malbehavior or indication of some sort in an environment, but also potentially the same indicator may indicate, I can verify now that I've effectively deployed a mitigation or remediation in the environment. And all of those can refer either to exactly the same element, or they can, in some cases, be completely different. Think patch level. I get a patch level by deploying a patch. I test it by looking at the patch level. I can compromise an environment and set an arbitrary patch level and lie to you so that looking at the patch level isn't adequate for you determining what is the actual patch level in an environment, and so may have to conduct forensic tests to be able to determine what's the actual patch level of an environment. Note in each of those cases, they all talk about patch level. Communicating just on the name of the attributes not adequate. We're going to have to pay attention to tense, and the source of the information in an environment in order to be able to make sense of EDR as we bring it into the rest of the security portfolio and that integration and operation that we're trying to do, especially as we try to bring in the shifted left kind of context, as we're doing with SBOM, as we're doing with DevSecOps, as we're doing increasingly where we're trying to align what we do in security across every one of the security disciplines, across development, across operations, and across the threat intelligence side of the fence so that we close the loop on those. The suggestion is just this, that we need to consider in sort of ontology whether things that are indications or behaviors or intended or expected or observed or parts of a verification in the process, and be able to label them relatively explicitly so that we know how to use them. So that I know that if something is intended is not what is observed, then I've got a discrepancy I might want to explain to myself. And once I decide that's bad or innocuous, then I've got a way of determining it's okay or not with some adoption of verification indication of some sort. That sense is part of closing the life cycle loop on development, on provisioning, on operations time, and on sort of the threat evolution time in the environment. But it isn't explicit in at least what I've been looking at in the ACT effort, in some of the other domains that have tried to focus on ontologies for only threat, where all this stuff is implicit. But the broader cybersecurity ontologies and schema that would involve things like PACE, where configuration and provisioning and sort of the more normal interactions have to be brought into focus with the threat side of the fence, it's going to be important to be able to be explicit about those.
And so it gets complicated.
Yeah.
But but the point is, the machine understanding of natural language is always going to be complicated. We can understand tense inherently when we say things, but computers don't inherently understand tense. And the difference between a description of first-order reality and an assessment or a prediction, which in all cases future tense is a prediction. You never know for 100% certainty if you're getting out of bed in the morning. You just assume it will be. So the computer needs to understand that either time-based or statement-based, what's a prediction and what is a statement of expected statement of fact or assessment. So yeah, we can make those provisions, but it gets complicated.
I think so. A simple place where we try to do something analogous is in the compliance space, where there was the expected value and the observed value, and a difference between them was an indication of non-compliance. And in that domain, it was super simple, right? The checklist had this, what I got from the API was that, and a difference was bad. But it was in that super simplistic way. There may be some middle ground that allows us to reason about, because of the source, whether this is an intended, unexpected, unobserved, if that makes sense, just to label it.
Well,
and
exactly.
then the analysis could be, go ahead.
So if you imagine two different graphs, you have a graph of the typical TTPs that an adversary uses independent of time, and then you have an observed graph in your network, and you basically want to be able to match the two to say, oh, this looks very similar to a TTP. These two graphs look sufficiently similar that I think there's a malicious activity happening, but the computer needs to understand which one is observed and which one is your template graph, if you will. And we can do that. We can absolutely do that, and that's what we want to be able to do, because that's when you start getting explainable AI.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think without it, we don't get explainability, we don't get interpretability, we don't even get trustability, because you don't have enough to be able to connect the dots. You lose even actionability to some extent. And the reason that's true is I think sometimes the indicators, the things we observe, have very little to do with the knobs and dials we would turn in response as mitigation or remediation. And so the connection between them is sometimes a process and not always a one-to-one sort of conceptual mapping in an equivalent sense. At any rate, what I'm going to do as a consequence of the effort going forward is try to collect what I think are these gotchas that are occurring as we look at how do we map what we're seeing in EDR into the rest of the security ecosystem in order to be able to say what is the right kind of consumption interface, the interaction boundary to bringing those in a way that allows us to start making sense of them in the same place where we're also having things like pace, which are much more normal in the way that they deal with configuration, much less dealing with emergent threat, much more dealing with known threat with a known set of indicators, if that makes sense. And I think that was it. So what I think happens over the next couple of weeks is I'll start accumulating more of these, at least I think they're considerations. They're things that I think need to be remembered and addressed to the extent that the track 2 has that broader ambition of bringing in full-blown EDR, NDR capability into the realm of looking across tools in a normalized way. I think we anchor at this sort of the telemetry side of the fence because they're all looking at the same assets that have the same configurations and a lot of the same instrumentation under the covers, but they're looking at them in different ways. And separately, at the mal side of the fence, that is, the attack behaviors are coming from attacks. Those are fairly unified, but their projection into each of the EDR tools, because there are differences in how they interpret the telemetry, or where things get fragmented to some extent. If we can normalize at least on those two fixed points, the two places where there isn't a difference across the tools, then I think we have some anchoring that we can use to make sense of where things are fundamentally different. And so I think it's still true after having done some digging into this that what we do to look at how the systems are provisioned, how they're operated, and how they are observable, and looking at the mal behaviors, both are good anchor points for the normalization of the rest of what is fragmented in the EDR telemetry itself. But connecting the dots is still a matter of the mappings. As far as I can tell, I don't see a way that it's completely implicit based on what each of the tools expose in their APIs or the metadata or the context that they expose. It doesn't look like that's adequate to do this without having additional markup information, additional contextual information.
Is there anywhere a subset of commands and or events that these EDR, XDR tools have that we can identify?
Well, they all have analogous capabilities. Think what a threat hunter does, right? He's going to get from an intelligence feed an indicator of some kind, and then he's going to hunt for it. And right at that point, things start to balkanize, because until the answer comes back from either the agent instrumentation or the analytics backend fabric, until that answer comes back, you don't get normalized again. You're in the world of the EDR tool. And so while you can have a function at a high level and you can have generally an input, what do I know when I trigger that function? What you get back can be very, very different depending on how things are correlated, how things are analyzed, how things are connected, and what that underlying model is. And so until you get all the way back to an alert again about a particular malware, it doesn't inherently get normalized. And so I think that's the problem, is you need functions that are the same across the EDR tools, but you need their inputs and outputs to also be correlatable. And that's a bit of a mess right now. if you just look across the EDR tools themselves.
No, I got you. That's why I said subset. It sounds like the way you answered it, there isn't even a subset of commonality. That's what I was asking.
Well, only because they break out either starting with an input that is maybe an indicator, and they break out then into their own domains where they're doing their own analysis, which isn't comparable to any other EDR tool. Think machine learning, right? And then many others.
I think of a simple use case. I can pretty much ask any EDR2 to isolate an endpoint. That's fairly consistent.
Yeah, but that's not threat hunting. That's mitigation, and you can do that with something like Case.
Right, but I'm talking to an EDR endpoint that's going to do the actual.
So yeah, if you do the non-EDR stuff, that is non-emergent threat stuff with EDR tools, then there is some commonality there that doesn't fragment because there's no need to go into analysis or advanced correlation or behavior representation. It's when you're in sort of the more complex threats and the emergent ones that things fragment pretty heavily. And so if you do that, if you focus only on the settings and things that you can test at an operating system API level, for instance, or in a network sort of setting level, if you focus on just those, then you don't need EDR tools at all. And there's no real reason to integrate CrowdStrike into it. It is the emergent threat side of the fence and the threat hunting that mandate the EDR tool. And that's what brings in the rest of the stuff that is not comparable, if that makes sense. Sorry, I've got a dog going berserk. So the whole intent of the conversation when it first started off was precisely this, that there's domains of EDR that aren't comparable across EDR solutions, that are connectable based on how they do things and how those things are distributed. And so if what we need is EDR capability, then those things need to be addressed. If the scope of what we're addressing does not need EDR capability, that is, can be dealt with simply sort of things I might do with an IPS and a control to a 5-tuple list in a firewall, then there isn't a reason to go through the effort of bringing EDR tools into the system, and there's no real relevance to that stuff. Detection and response certainly is a broad area. EDR tools are there because of those sort of harder to constrain, harder to characterize, and harder to compare kinds of effort. And so that is the stuff I'm focusing on because I want to close that gap, right? But it's not the lowest hanging fruit by a long shot, if that makes sense.
Oh, no. I'm just trying to find building block approach here. That's all. I'm just thinking about, okay, it's a detection and response. So there's detection stuff and there's response stuff, right? In a macro level. I'm just trying to figure out if there's, a way we can iterate on laying out what the EDR tool interactions would be. If you go back to our diagrams, right? And how would it talk and how would we see it? Is there something we can iterate on to just kind of build that out, what we're missing, what we have? I know that's not consistent, but I'm trying to figure out a model we can evolve versus I'm trying to figure out how we get there from here.
Yeah, and I think we know more about doing that for EDR proper. That is, if the detections and the responses are simple enough and the connection between them is simple enough, then you're doing it with very normal technologies that don't need EDR. If they're not simple enough, then all of a sudden the mapping between the inputs and the responses gets more sophisticated. It may involve hunting, may involve analytics, and as those go across the tools, they're less comparable. And so the more capability we have, the more that simpler abstraction that you just described, that at some level I've got an indication, I do something, and I've got a response, that black box can get very complicated on the inside, and deciding that it's comparable across tools gets just as complicated. And so it's
I got you there.
Yeah,
I got you. We'll just take your example as an example. Go hunting. Wouldn't that be an interesting example of a common action I could take to any EDR thing? And it may do different things as you described. I can completely understand that. But at least I've got an architecture that says, I know I've got something out there to hunt, tell it to go hunt. As an example. And the other one is analytics. Run your analytics. An example of a macro. Go run your analytics. I know it's all proprietary. I know it's all unique, but at least I can take that action because I know I've got problems on the endpoint that I need the EDR tool to address for me. Those are examples of what I was thinking of how we, macro into a micro approach to this thing.
No, that makes sense, but what's hiding under the covers is the second that those two analytics aren't comparable, then I can't have a policy statement that says go run those analytics and do something as a result, because the two results aren't comparable. So the challenge is exactly what you're describing. If I can't turn that black box into a white box and get comparability across those, then I can't automate the go do this across CrowdStrike and Carbon Black and have the result be something I can understand, much less expect.
No, I get it. I'm just trying to peel the onion. So I hear you. But
well, and you can, but it means shining the light on some of the black boxness. It means picking abstractions where both the inputs and the outputs can be correlated in terms of your expectation or at least intention. And if you do that, then you can get exactly what you're suggesting, the ability to orchestrate across multiple different EDR tools and have it do something understandable, something expectable, something you can trust.
Right.
That's
No, I
not
completely
true.
agree.
It's complete black box. Go ahead.
No, I got you. I mean, I'm just reliving my network days where we didn't have MIBs and we did set, start up on that, and it was the same exact discussion you're having. But nowadays, you set stuff up in an SNMP environment and things run. I mean, we had to get there, but we started with what you're talking about: it's chaos and proprietariness and unique data flows and all that other junk.
I'm just not sure anybody would take on the challenge of trying to map all of threat hunting in response to SNMP calls right now. So
oh no, it's just an example. It's just an example. I mean, in this case, we would look at something else, but I'm just trying to iterate on how do we, make progress on the black box.
Oh yeah. So I think this is sort of the two ends of the spectrum. I think there is low-hanging fruit that you can do. It isn't all-encompassing and doesn't cover all detection and response scenarios. Right. But there is also the opportunity to move the ball forward on the much more balkanized side of the fence. That is, how do I use all of the capabilities across different EDR tools in a way that makes sense? I think we can make headway on that one, and that's the part of the boulder that I'm pushing on right now.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So this is farther looking, but that is my understanding is that's why we split into two tracks. One of them aiming at the low-hanging fruit, those convenient normalizations that may not address the whole problem that you're describing. And I'm intentionally pushing harder, but we can do that in a tighter forum if that's not something that we want everybody distracted with.
Gotcha. Yep, makes sense.
Does that make sense to anybody else? I'm Forrest, and you guys should push back here.
I think you hit on and this is probably already on the table. We really need a process. And I think we need to extend the scope of Sticks Shifter to something, broader. But that concept of trying to, it's a process that needs to drive these translations, static taxonomies and tables, and it really needs to be a process that can incorporate MLAI, some natural language processing, and really, most importantly, I think ontologies. And again, I say the word ontologies because I don't think we're going to get one ring to rule them all. But I think that's why it needs to come down to a process that we can plug in and extend the reasoning and I don't know fidelity of how that process can see the world and translate things. Does that make sense?
It does, and I couldn't agree more. Yeah. But I think it needs to process that effort to move the ball forward. There is going to be processing in parallel with the less ambitious, more expedient.
Oh yeah, and we need an inventory of all these things to really start that anyway. So it's not. But at the end of the day, I've been trying to do this for find this quote unquote one ring to rule them all, and just end up creating another ring to be ruled. And I'm going to keep saying that because it's not a thing; it's a process to kind of get into quantum gravity and that kind of it's not a thing; it's a process.
Right. It is.
So Russ, I've shamelessly used up almost all the time.
No, I don't need much time, and you did not shame me because I'm pestering you all the way along, just so I can kind of help you, trying to figure out how to help. So I was part of the guilty party of causing this much trouble. So not a problem at all, buddy. Not a problem. Thank you for this discussion again and leading the discussion for us, Dennis. I do appreciate it.
Sure.
Send me this updated deck you just did, and I'll send it back out. I'll post it back out to the GitHub.
I'll do it.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it again.
How do I stop?
Any other comments before we switch topics? All right. We've exhausted them, Dennis. Okay. Let me share something then. Sharing is caring. Caring is sharing. Okay. All righty. Okay. Something else that I wanted to do with you guys is the discussion I had on the white paper last week. I kind of put an outline together. I don't know if you guys saw it when I sent it out a little earlier today. And I also in the email linked you to the old obsolete white paper, which talked about OpenDXL and SCAP and all those things. So we got to fix all that. So what I thought I'd do is just lay out what I think the white paper is going to be, and get your guys' feedback on what we're trying to do here and make sure we're all in sync. I do want to also talk about intended audiences, because depending on who I'm talking to in OCA, I've got different people thinking I'm talking to different people, right? We could be talking to developers. We're looking for people to develop, connectors and stick shifter stuff and paste stuff and yada, yada. True. We're looking at technology companies to implement some of this stuff. We're looking at integrators to use it. And we're looking at our end users, right? Who are saying, yeah, I got this complicated mess out there. And how is OCA helping me get it any more simpler, better, cheaper, faster, right? Those are all possible audiences for the paper. I have a feeling when we write the paper, we will probably derive multiple papers off of it to hit these audiences specifically. So the way I was going to approach the paper was these all encompassing as we can, and then we will subdivide it into a paper for, other developers are trying to recruit to help us build integration things or connector things. Technology companies are having to be trying to recruit to help bring them in because they have key technologies that would really help us achieve our collaboration initiatives, so forth. Okay, so does that make sense? We do know there's multiple audiences, but we'll set the paper up to kind of address the whole broad spectrum. We'll label them, who the target interest parties are, and then later on we can parse it out. You okay with that approach so far?
That makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd one general comment on end users. I think we need to target both a technical audience and a leadership audience.
Okay, I agree. I'll do that. Probably all three.
So
I do.
that's
Yeah.
a good point, Patrick. Are you maybe just a different lens? Is that in addition to this, or would developers, integrators
These would be
be
different, right?
technical,
Developers,
and then leadership,
Yeah.
end users? I don't know.
it would be different, Forrest. I think the developers I'm looking for could be open source developers, could be college people, right?
Yeah.
People that
Okay.
That's a different audience than these
Right,
others.
implementers, technical implementers, and decision makers.
Exactly.
Sure.
Exactly.
Sure.
And
Got
then
it.
we have to anyway. Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, I agree. So I put three in here, Patrick, because I also think from a business point of view, we want to just divide the business value of this, I think. And then from the, CXO point of view, from the executive point of view, what the perspective of how OCA can help them achieve their goals. So I'll put that in there. Okay,
Yeah,
so then I outline the
I think
paper.
the main point. I think the main point I'm trying to make is there's two different stories that we need to tell for those audiences. Whereas
Yes.
in other cases, it's probably pretty consistent.
Yeah,
Anyway, we're good. I don't want to overthink it.
No, you're right. I think you're right, Patrick. Yep. And it's certainly valuable. As when I've tried to help recruit companies for OCA, we do get into the technical discussion versus the business discussion, and usually have to parse the two out all the time. So I agree. I 100% agree with what you're saying. It has to happen. Okay, so what I did was I laid out what I thought was relevant facts. I don't want to keep this paper pretty short. I don't want it to be more than 20 pages. But I thought we'd start with what the heck are our objectives, and we've written them down, and I'll pull them from the charter. But I think we ought to reiterate what is OCA all about. I'll pull it from the objectives we put together as a project. Then I thought I'd branch into what's our approach for collaboration. Because collaboration is kind of the key for the objectives. An overview of what are we thinking for now, and what are we looking to do to enable collaboration across the security domains. So that was kind of this section. Then I'd overview each of the projects and each of the work groups we have. What do we got going on? So that'd be a section. And then the final section is where can you go to learn more and how can you get involved? If you like this stuff, or if you want to listen in, where do I go and how do I keep informed? That kind of stuff. So kind of three sections. The first, what are we all about? And the first part, how do we break that down a little bit? And then the second is, what are we doing? And then the third one is, how can you get involved, or how can you keep up to date? So that was the thought behind the outline. I'd love any comments.
At this level of detail, I'd say it's straightforward and to the point and appropriate.
Okay, good. Yeah, hopefully.
And would you see the value proposition argument being stated in the objectives?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. And then repeat it in the, somewhere along the line where we talk about, the from the technical point of view, the objectives, and the business point of view, the objectives. So it'll be repeated a little bit more, but I think at the highest level, there'll be some objectives up there, right? Dealing with the reducing complexity, costs,
Yep.
being able to find things quicker, that yada, yada, but we'll figure that out. But yeah, it's definitely in the objectives. I think that's one of our objectives, right?
Yeah, there was something came across my bow today from three or four different vendors that are obviously working together to solve these issues. Of course, when you constrain it to a very narrow, you don't need to solve it for the world. You can actually, build specific. But anyway, the point is the success is driven by getting those folks, participating in this conversation rather than narrowly focusing on their current, technologies and how they can make them work together with other things. We need to bring those people into the conversation. So, but again, that's that balance between I need to get a product out the door and I don't want to boil the ocean here. I just need to do this thing. So trying to get that balance and get engagement, especially with vendors.
Completely agree. There's also a tipping point on our side is until we start producing things that are of value, they'll kind of sit on the sidelines and wait until we do something and continue to do proprietary until then. So until we can provide added value to them to change the way they're developing or doing things that'll be more effective, then they'll continue to do what they're doing. Right. So there's that end too.
Need some reference implementation.
Reference implementations are key. Yeah, collateral they can use and leverage is key. We have some of that in the GitHub's not enough, but we certainly have some. But that's the kind of the tipping point on the technology side. Okay, so
I found even when you have the reference implementation working and give it away, engagement still. I got to build it. I got to not only talk about it, I got to actually build it. I got to develop all the code, all the pieces, all the. In my case, I did NetWitness and ArcSight as essentially this thing. The integration and translation, and publish it all up on the DSI website. And I couldn't even get one person to ask. I even volunteered to fly out on a plane and help them install it, and couldn't give it away.
I hear you. I hear you. I hear you. I mean, and being part of a technology vendor, I know some of the inertia is also, look, I'm already building this now. It's too expensive to change it. I don't have time, yada, yada. And even if this is better, so what? It's like, sometimes that happens.
Well, no, the advantage is now 12 years later is these are not, what I did was very, 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 very custom.
Right.
I had my own schemas. Anyway.
Okay. So anyway, I'm going to publish this out on our GitHub. I'm looking for volunteers and helpers. I'm not the Oracle of knowledge, so I'm certainly looking for help. And I will be trying, and I know I got somebody to volunteer from the last call. Sergio, I think, is going to help me, but I'm looking for anybody to text me or email me or Slack me or whatever you'd like. If you can help in any section, be happy to have it. I'll put this out on a Google Doc so we can collaborate that way. But I'm always looking for help to see if we can pull this thing together in a reasonable amount of time. I'm hoping this doesn't take me 6 months like the last one did, but you never know. Okay. So that's all I had for my topic. Does anybody else have anything else? Oh, can you put your chart one up just for fun? Do that here. Dennis, can you put your chart one up? Duncan just joined us. I want him to see it.
The
The first page of your presentation. I know he'd
oh,
love
okay,
to see
yeah.
it. I know he'd love to see it.
I haven't seen it either. Now I'm curious.
Okay. Oh, it's exciting.
You circulated it ahead of time, so I know what it's going to say. Thank you.
I'm trying to be transparent, Duncan. There it is. You see it on the video? There you go. We've labeled.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Hopefully that'll get us started anyway. So I appreciate that Dennis, you took an initiative and put that in there.
Now, we're not inventing our own here, right?
No.
No,
Okay,
in
good.
fact,
Good.
almost exactly this
It scared me
text.
I see the link now. Okay.
The only editing that happened was I tried to recognize there are multiple contributing authors in the sense that we have these conversations and those comments and contributions make it into this text. So it's not one author,
Yep.
as was the prototype text.
Exactly. That's very, very true. It's a working
Danger, Will
document.
Robinson.
We appreciate it. Okay, any other comments? Any other comments, questions? For those that arrived late, I did record the session, so I'll post that out to YouTube tomorrow, and I'll also post the material out again. So in case you missed anything, you can replay it. It'll be out there tomorrow. Okay, everybody, thanks again, everybody, for the discussion. Really appreciate it. Good conversation. Do appreciate that you guys spent the time working with us on this.
Thanks, Russ.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Bye all.